Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture, and for once it looks like we got a legitimately slow week. Major releases seem to be drying up, and that means I had to go digging in the underground for the majority of what we're covering here. Luckily, found some gems in there, so let's get to it on the Pulse. Got 6 albums on the docket this week, but let's go back a few weeks and talk about, from Oranssi Pazuzu, Mestarin Kynsi. So full disclosure, this is a side of black metal I haven't often talked about, psychedelic black metal, where the screams and tremolo shredding is more discordant and off-kilter and weird than ever, taking the dissonance into even stranger territory. Now into this comes Oranssi Pazuzu, who's been on my radar for a little bit, so I listened through their entire back catalog and, well, it's odd, even despite probably their most enveloping and potent work being 2013's Valaniliu, with everything since they pulled further away from black metal towards wonkier psychedelic contortions, and that furious tension has felt increasingly hit and miss, no more so than on Mestarin Kynsi. Hell, I'd argue this project is the furthest from black metal I've heard yet, as it'll twist into more abrasive psychedelic and even drone passages with synth layering and some distorted female vocals, at least until the end of the project where they've gotta bring back some traditional raw and chaotic black metal. And truth be told, I'm not sure they need to make that hard pivot at the end, because the heaviness coming from the sludgier or even thrash side on a couple songs was just as credible and kind of awesome. And when you have a project as alien and unpredictably suffocating as this is, you don't really need to default to what we already know. Now, when you've got albums like this that get by on nightmare fuel, what actually hits the unholy sweet spot between unsettlingly weird and just kind of obtuse, it's a bit of a blurry one, and Oranssi Pazuzu don't always hit it. Some of the keyboard passages run long and repetitive, while the transitions tend to be great, the dynamics and atmosphere don't always give the heavier passages room to breathe, and like most psychedelic-tinged albums in the modern age, the compression and jarring tonal pivots can feel kind of overused. And once I translated the lyrics from Finnish, they felt a little boilerplate for metal, pushing on Lovecraftian, unknowable nightmares, although, again, I'm sure some of the poetry got inevitably lost in translation. And as such, while it is experimental and winning over a lot of folks and critics on how alien and weird it is, I have heard more implacable and shocking extreme metal albums, and while this is certainly really good, I'm not sure it's gonna suck me back into the maw all that often. The more kinetic midsection tracks though, excellent. So for me, strong 7 out of 10. Worth listen. Next up, the self-titled album from ShrapKnel.
When the Harlem boys quiet 10 pace, make haste for that $3 pistol whip. Onomatopoeia with the one and only mixer flick.
You know, whenever I start complaining that I haven't heard enough good hip-hop in the course of a year, someone just needs to kick me and remind me that there's just more I just haven't heard that's right under my damn nose. Case in point, ShrapKnel, a collaboration between Prem Rock and Curly Castro and put out through Backwood Studios. If you've been listening to underground hip-hop, you probably recognize at least one of those names. For me, it was Curly Castro, who I knew from Arm & Hammer and Uncommon NASA projects, which, when you factor in Elucid on production for the majority of this album, that should give you a rough idea of this sound. It should also give you an idea of how great it is. It's grimy, distorted, with clattering percussion and discordant guitars and keys that always seem constantly on the cusp of falling apart, and the ominous atmosphere, it's damn near omnipresent as Curly Castro and Prem Rock go bar for bar, the former a little more nasal, animated, and immediate, the latter a little more gruff, but subtly imposing. It's a really good balance, and when you want to stack up bar after bar full of comic book, movie, sports, and underground hip-hop references, full of braggadocious flair with more hooks than you would otherwise expect in this subgenre, juxtaposed with some retrospective moments to childhood on cuts like 86 to 96 probably, that grounds a lot of the points of references both good and ill, it makes for a really well-paced, layered, but potent as hell listen. And for establishing our two MCs with well-placed guest stars and the occasional political potshot that was very welcome, this is a really potent starting point for me, but I do think there were opportunities for a little bit more diversity in the content, or the feel that individual cuts built up to more. It's one reason why I like Beset as a moment of post-breakup brooding, or Estranged Fruit with Billy Woods and highlighting different brands of bitter isolation. In a way, the album does kind of live live up to its title. Fractured, cutting, wild, strewn amidst the ruins and more dangerous than you would realize, but almost implying a greater whole rather than comprising it directly. And I will say, if you've listened to a lot of underground hip-hop, a lot of this will absolutely feel familiar, and I wouldn't precisely call it groundbreaking, at least for me. But you know what? In a year that's short of great hip-hop thus far, it fits the bill really well. Light 8 out of 10. You should all hear this. Next up from Whitney Rose, We Still Go To Rodeos.
They all say bless her heart. She never had a chance.
I'm kind of kicking myself for letting Whitney Rose fall off my radar. She's a Canadian working in indie country. I really liked her 2015 album, Heartbreaker of the Year, and yet she put out 2 projects in 2017 that I wound up missing. Now, part of this was me struggling to get a handle on my Patreon schedule that year, but I will admit that outside of a few great moments, I wasn't quite wowed by South Texas Suite or Rule 62. Her sound was picking up a lot of elements of Texas honky tonk, and that was kind of an odd fit for her more subtle, smoldering delivery. So I really wanted to cover her newest project and get a handle on where she was going next, and the answer is something close to late 80s and early 90s neo-traditional country with a lot more rock elements, which is a fit I wish worked better, and I lay the majority of the blame on her producer, Paul Kolderie, who, if you know that era of late 80s and early 90s indie rock, might be a familiar name thanks to his work with the Lemonheads, or Hole, or the Pixies, and oh yeah, Radiohead. This is the guy who produced Pablo Honey, and while he's been a little less active in recent years, you'd think him producing a country project might be intriguing. Sadly, it's another case of a producer who's slightly misaligned with the artist in question, because while the guitars have a lot of warmth and interplay and texture here, the grooves unfortunately don't, and it gets even more frustrating opposite Whitney Rose's voice. The one thing I didn't need to come back from early 90s rock was putting the vocals further back in the mix, especially when Whitney Rose is such a subtle, understated performer. Now, this would be where I would go to the lyrics, and sadly, while Rose's relationship storytelling might be mature and frank in discussing where things went awry, or where she wishes they could have worked, or she hopes where they're working now, the framing feels oddly passive. Even the most detailed storytelling on the opener, Just Circumstance, doesn't really assign any blame or action beyond calling it just circumstance, which yes, is more appropriate than blaming the girl here, but in the larger context of the album, just kind of distances you from the story a bit. It just doesn't build much in the way of emotive tension, not helped by some wonky sequencing driven by shifts in tonal balance track to track, and when the writing can already feel a little undercooked, there's just not much that really pulls me back. It's not a bad album, but like her last few projects, they're not really playing to her strengths. So, strong 6 out of 10. It's good. Not great, though. Next up from Alina Baraz, It Was Divine. So I've covered Alina Baraz before, back when I was still making The Trailing Edge, and I made the observation that even then she was pulling a lot from Jhené Aiko for her sound, albeit with a stronger pop tinge. Generally agreeable, but not a lot that really stood out to me. In retrospect, I probably should have given her more credit, because over the past couple of years, the trend in R&B has been towards Jhené's sound, and following on to this album, Alina Baraz wound up a step ahead and continuing down that path. But I feel like this project is another example of albums that embrace a lot of textures and tones I really like, but struggle in the compositional department to really assemble a good hook or production that feels as warm or potent as it could be, which was an issue in Alina Baraz's previous work as well, and just as true here, just spread over a much longer album. And again, it's one of those cases, I like the tones, I like the approach here. Alina Baraz is a great subtle singer, she's amazingly expressive, her vocals are placed well, she's got great chemistry with her guest, especially Khalid, and the balance of gentle, textured acoustics with more hip-hop adjacent percussion, it's solid. But when you dig into the compositions and writing more deeply, the issues start cropping up. For one, as inspired by Jhené as this is, there is a lyrical tone and arc, even across Chilombo, that was love-struck, but complicated. Read between the lines, and there was a lot more going on besides just straightforward bedroom jams, which is the vast majority of what Alina Baraz has. Yes, Say You Know is a confrontation during the relationship's collapse, and there are moments you can tell where she's intending the love song more for herself, but I gotta be honest, the introspection's pretty thin, lacking distinctive detail, and without that slight bit of complexity, the album really starts to run together. On top of that, she tries to integrate some beat switches into more down-tempo moments in the interludes, and they feel a lot more clunky than they should, often a factor of the weedy keyboards and guitars that slide off-key, and some leaden beats that really make me wish for the live drums. Still, it's absolutely a project that does that one thing really damn well. Nas, of all people, shows up for a really solid verse near the end, and even if this does run long, I do really like that smooth kick into the guitar solo on Take It Home. So, yeah, very light 7 out of 10. Still worth hearing. Check it out. Next up from AWOLNATION, Angel Miners and the Lightning Riders. This is the third AWOLNATION album I've reviewed, and at this point I'm a little at a loss why the material isn't sticking with me whatsoever. It's bombastic, it careens across styles, it usually winds up a total mess. Frontman Aaron Bruno is clearly trying to make something stick, and yet when you are 4 albums in and I can barely recall a melody or an interesting turn of phrase from those albums outside of Sail, that's a big problem. A band that's trying so hard to sound so impactful should not sound this forgettable. And it's not just one thing here either. The more obvious culprit seems to be production, where whenever you would expect those revving anthemic guitars to really kick up, they're always a little bit too far back in the mix, and pairing with painfully underweight bass and drum patterns don't help. Then there's Aaron Bruno himself, who has some dynamic personality as a singer, but never seems to grasp how to accentuate it all that well. And given that he's produced all the AWOLNATION albums in-house, you can probably blame him for how the band is consistently stuck 2 years behind the times, with no real production crunch or flavor. That's the other glaring flaw. For as much as the band, especially here, tries to emphasize their wild, radical, renegade credentials in their lyrics, when of course they're not trying to subvert them to utterly neuter any sense of power or bombast or atmosphere, which when you're writing a song about the California wildfires that destroyed your home studio, you'd think you'd bring some sense of intensity, but well, I would say they were devoured by the Imagine Dragon, but that's not even a thing anymore, and when they were doing that sound originally, back at the beginning of the decade, they were okay at it. What's all the more emblematic of is the same thing that's happened to Purity Ring. They might have been at the forefront of the sound initially, but then that sound got beaten into the ground, and compositionally, they could just never keep up as their identity became less distinct. So much so that when they collaborated with Rivers Cuomo on Pacific Coast Highway in the movies, it sounds like a Pacific Daydream era Weezer song, and a pretty bad one. Alright, look, maybe you can frame this as a back-to-basics approach as they're now on a new label, but the production and compositions are toothless. This mess has long stopped being interesting, the sequencing is incredibly sloppy, and again, a project trying this hard to be anthemic, it should never be this boring. 4 out of 10, no recommendation. And finally, from Quelle Chris and Chris Keys, Innocent Country 2. And circling back to the topic of great underground hip-hop that I needed to cover, yeah, this was one I saw coming, but it was a follow-up to a project from Quelle Chris that I didn't really love. The original Innocent Country came out in 2015, and it was solid enough, but it was overshadowed by Shotgun and Sleek Rifle and Ghost of the Finish Line beforehand, and its considerably more ambitious projects that I've reviewed in the past couple of years. In retrospect, I might have missed the point initially. As a whole, Innocent Country 1 felt more subtle and low-key and introspective, in comparison with the more straightforward bars or outright weirdness that surrounds it, which if you read Quelle Chris's commentary on the album, that was intentional. That project was more internally focused, amplifying the dualities and vices he would later explore in more depth on Being You Is Great, I Wish It Could Be You More Often, whereas Innocent Country 2 is looking outwards, where after a rather hilarious recap and coda to the first album, it's not just about finding comfort and security in oneself, but also among larger communities, with this album making a very pointed turn towards black communities specifically about midway through, which isn't unfamiliar given his past couple projects, but the more meditative focus as a whole, it reminded me a lot more of Solange's A Seat at the Table, which places me, again, on the outside looking in, which is not a detraction to this album, but kind of interesting given how in terms of language and structure, I'd argue it's easily one of his most accessible albums in recent years. What I have noticed though is that for as much as he highlights black excellence, he's canny enough to coax it through songs that'll both question the systems that put forward that aspiration and will highlight those who play into those systems for more validation for themselves, which can leave a bit of a hollow experience, but he also doesn't excuse himself, and he's so damn playful and funny in how he frames this introspection that it never feels accusatory or preachy, which might be the best way to go, especially when he's so self-aware keenly about his struggles and humanity. And when you match it with production from Chris Keys that is this warm and textured and jazzy, but in a way that naturally complements Quelle Chris's slightly odd flow and his pretty stacked repertoire of guests, the big standouts for me being Homeboy Sandman, Earl Sweatshirt, and Denmark Vesey of all people dropping one of his best verses in recent memory, it's just an extremely easy album to sink into and really savor the little details. This album rewards a lot of patience. You will find more layers here. But at the same time, like most Quelle Chris projects, it does run a little long, and the mid-tempo pace and fewer immediate hooks mean that if you're not actively engaged, it might slide into the background a bit. I will say it's probably Quelle Chris's most consistent album in a long time, but that can be a bit of a mixed blessing without a lot of standout moments that are more immediate. I'd argue they're still there, but they're a bit more subtle. Again, this rewards patience. But like most Quelle Chris albums in recent years, the more listens I gave, the more this grew on me. So while I think it's pretty great now, give it 8 or so months in the summer where I'm sure this is going to play wonderfully, I can see this being among the best of the year. As of now, though, solid 8 out of 10. I have needed hip-hop like this in 2020 just to chill out and vibe to and get me to really think, and you all need to hear it. Something special. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I don't have a ton of albums to talk about, but comments are right there. Have fun with your discussions. I'm sure they might be contentious. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, I understand right now, while it's contributing to help support the channel might be a little bit stressful, we live in hard times. But if you'd like to help impact my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.